In the spring of 1947, a cartographer's simple line on a map sparked a migration so vast, so violent, it became the largest mass human movement in recorded history and one of its most forgotten nightmares. This is the story of partition. This is not the genteel handover of power you might imagine. It is a story of a line drawn in haste, a wound ripped open across the belly of a continent. A British barrister who had never been east of Paris, Cyril Radcliffe, was given 5 weeks to carve up 400,000 square kilometers of land between two new nations, India and Pakistan. He had no expertise, no detailed maps, and no time. The tools of his trade? Outdated census reports, colonial gazetteers, and an impossible mandate to separate the inseparable. The cost of his lines? Somewhere between 1 and 2 million lives, and the displacement of over 15 million souls. How could a single line ignite such a firestorm? And why has the full, horrific reality of that human cataclysm been so softly spoken for so long? To understand the scale of the coming deluge, we must first grasp the tectonic pressures building beneath the surface of British India. For nearly 2 centuries, the British Raj had perfected a strategy of divide and rule, particularly between the subcontinent's 2 largest religious communities, Hindus and Muslims. This wasn't incidental friction. It was a cultivated tool of governance. Separate electorates were created. Political concessions were doled out to one community to check the ambitions of another. A sense of competing identities was systematically hardened. By the early 20th century, as the movement for Indian independence swelled, so too did the fear among many Muslims of being permanently marginalized in a Hindu-majority India. From this anxiety, the idea of Pakistan was born. Championed by Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League, it began as a vague concept, a demand for political safeguards, but crystallized into a demand for a separate Muslim homeland. The rallying cry was Pakistan, an acronym coined from Punjab, Afghan province, northwest frontier, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan. It was a promise of self-determination, a refuge from perceived future Hindu domination. For the Indian National Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, this was an anathema. They envisioned a secular, unified India where religion was a private matter, not a political boundary. The stage was set for an irreconcilable clash of visions. World War II broke the dam. Britain, exhausted and bankrupt, could no longer hold its empire. A new Labour government in London was desperate to withdraw. The last viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, was sent with a single directive: transfer power and fast. Mountbatten, a man of royal bearing and decisive, often rash action, moved the date for independence forward by nearly a year to August 1947. This single, hurried decision had catastrophic consequences. It gave the political process no time to manage the mechanics of division. The principle of partition was accepted, but the border itself? That was a detail to be worked out later by a man who knew nothing of the land he was about to bisect. Cyril Radcliffe arrived in Delhi on July 8, 1947. He was a man of impeccable legal reputation, but zero geographical or cultural knowledge of India. He was given a chair, a fan, and a deadline. He was not shown the Border Commission's own reports forecasting massive violence in mixed areas. He worked in isolation, surrounded by teams of Hindu and Muslim judges who argued relentlessly over every village, every well, every inch of railway track. Radcliffe's task was impossible: to draw a line that created coherent, defensible states while also respecting contiguous majority areas of Muslims and non-Muslims. But populations were not neatly sorted. They were a kaleidoscope. In the crucial provinces of Punjab and Bengal, Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs lived cheek by jowl, their lives and economies woven together for centuries. There were villages that were majority Muslim, but whose lands were owned by Hindu landlords. There were districts where Sikh shrines sat surrounded by Muslim villages. There were rivers that were the lifeblood of communities on both banks. The line had to cut through all of this. Radcliffe later admitted he hoped never to visit India again, so he wouldn't have to see the consequences of his work. His final award was ready only on August 12, 1947. It was not published until August 17th, 2 full days after independence. This meant that for 2 critical days, millions of people were citizens of new countries, but had no idea which one they were in. The maps were locked in a vice-regal safe while the world outside exploded. But the violence did not wait for the line to be announced. The summer of 1947 became a pressure cooker of rumor, fear, and ancient vendettas. As the reality of partition set in, communities that had lived together for generations began to see each other with new, suspicious eyes. Neighbors became potential enemies overnight. The first flames of organized violence flickered in March in the Punjab city of Rawalpindi. Hindu and Sikh mobs, then Muslim mobs in retaliation, began attacking minorities. It was a grim preview. The local administration, demoralized and with its British officers looking toward their own evacuation, often stood by or collapsed entirely. The police and military, themselves divided along religious lines, were frequently unreliable or complicit. A terrible logic took hold. If Pakistan was for Muslims and India for Hindus and Sikhs, then each country should be cleansed of its minorities. This wasn't state policy, but it became a widely accepted, horrific folk policy enacted with terrifying efficiency. The epicenter of the horror was Punjab. This fertile, prosperous province of farmers and soldiers was to be split clean down the middle. Radcliffe's line cut through its heart, severing canals from the fields they irrigated, dividing villages from their ancestral graveyards, separating families from their kin. When the final award was published, the dam broke completely. What followed was not just a riot or a pogrom. It was a mutual genocide. Armed bands, often led by demobilized soldiers from World War II, began systematic campaigns. They would descend on a village of the other religion, surround it, and methodically kill the men, abduct the women, and loot the property. The brutality was intimate and unimaginable. Neighbors who had shared meals turned on each other with axes, scythes, and kerosene. Temples and mosques were desecrated. Trains became rolling charnel houses. Perhaps the most infamous symbol of partition's horror is the ghost train. Trains would leave Lahore for Amritsar, or Amritsar for Lahore, packed with refugees. They would arrive at their destination silent, every single passenger inside. Men, women, children slaughtered. The platforms would be littered with corpses. This happened not once, but dozens of times. The perpetrators were often from the very communities the refugees were fleeing to, seeking revenge for a similar atrocity committed against their own people. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of butchery. Within this vortex of violence, women suffered a specific, targeted fate. They were not merely killed. They were treated as the literal currency of community honor. Thousands were abducted, raped, forcibly married, and converted. Families, fearing this fate for their daughters and wives, began to enact what they saw as the ultimate protection: martyrdom. There are countless, heart-shattering accounts from both sides of mothers poisoning their children or throwing them into wells before taking their own lives. Fathers killing their entire families to save them from a worse fate at the hands of the mob. This mass suicide, known as martyrdom, Shahidi, among Sikhs and Jauhar among some Hindus, remains one of the most traumatic, contested memories of partition. It was not madness. It was a choice made in the face of a terror deemed worse than death. The scale of the migration defies comprehension. It was a human river flowing in 2 opposite directions, each stream carrying a tide of misery. From East Punjab, now in India, millions of Hindus and Sikhs trudged west toward what they hoped was safety in India. From West Punjab in Pakistan, millions of Muslims moved east toward the new Muslim homeland. The columns stretched for miles. People walked until they dropped, carrying whatever they could on their heads or in bullock carts. They died of thirst, exhaustion, and cholera. They were attacked on the road by armed bands. They forded rivers swollen with monsoon rains, leaving the weak and elderly to drown. The newly formed governments of India and Pakistan were utterly overwhelmed. They had inherited a collapsing state apparatus and were now tasked with managing an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. Refugee camps sprung up, mere holding pens of disease and despair where thousands died daily. But partition was not one event. It was three. While Punjab's carnage was the most concentrated and ferocious, Bengal in the east also endured its own, slightly different trauma. Here, the violence was less a wild fire of mutual slaughter and more a slower, grinding pressure of eviction and fear. The border here, also drawn by Radcliffe, was even more absurd, creating the geographically nonsensical East Pakistan, which would later become Bangladesh, separated from West Pakistan by over 1,000 miles of Indian territory. In Bengal, the migration was more staggered, but over the following decades, millions still crossed the porous border, driven by economic pressure and periodic riots. The memories here are of a quieter, more insidious uprooting. And then there was the princely state of Kashmir, a Muslim-majority region with a Hindu Maharaja, which Radcliffe pointedly left unassigned. Its fate was to be decided by accession, a decision that would spark the first India-Pakistan War within months of independence and lay the groundwork for a conflict that remains unresolved today. The line Radcliffe drew did not create peace. It created a permanent fracture. The role of the departing British has been the subject of furious debate. Could they have managed a more orderly withdrawal? Almost certainly. Mountbatten's rush is widely condemned by historians. The British Indian Army, still a formidable, disciplined force in early 1947, was hastily divided along religious lines and its units withdrawn from peacekeeping duties, leaving a security vacuum at the precise moment it was needed most. Many British officers seemed more concerned with a graceful exit than with preventing a bloodbath. There was a profound failure of moral and administrative responsibility at the very top. Yet, amidst the horror, there are also breathtaking acts of humanity. There are countless stories of individual Muslims hiding Hindu families in their attics at the risk of their own lives, of Sikh villagers forming protective cordons around Muslim neighbors, of people who refuse the madness. A famous story tells of Khushwant Singh's father in the town of Hadali, who stood at his door with a kirpan, Sikh ceremonial sword, and declared he would kill the first man, Muslim or Sikh, who tried to harm the local Muslims. His courage saved a community. These stories are the fragile, essential counter-narrative to the overwhelming brutality. They prove that the hatred was not inevitable, but a poison that was allowed to spread. In the anatomy of catastrophe, the smallest artery of kindness can be the most vital. The aftermath was a landscape of trauma and reinvention. The two new nations were born in trauma, their national identities forged in opposition to each other. In India, the secular ideal was immediately tested by the influx of millions of Hindu and Sikh refugees, whose harrowing tales hardened attitudes toward Pakistan. In Pakistan, the very rationale of the state as a homeland for Muslims was cemented by the perceived necessity of escape from Hindu oppression. The refugees on both sides had to rebuild shattered lives from nothing. They settled in squatter colonies on the edges of Delhi, Karachi, Lahore, and Calcutta. They brought with them their skills, their cuisine, their dialects, and their deep, unhealed wounds, transforming the cultures of their new cities. The partition of property and assets was another nightmare. People who owned vast lands in West Punjab arrived in India as paupers. A complex system of evacuee property was created, but it was riddled with corruption and never came close to compensating for the loss. For decades, the memory of partition was suppressed. It was too painful, too shameful, too contradictory to the founding myths of both nations. India wanted to celebrate its hard-won freedom, not dwell on its bloody birth. Pakistan wanted to focus on Islamic unity, not on the horrors that accompanied its creation. Survivors were often told to forget, to move on, to not burden the next generation with their stories. The history books in both countries presented sanitized versions, a tragic but inevitable price for freedom. The full, guttural truth of the violence, the sexual atrocities, the betrayals, was relegated to private family lore, whispered behind closed doors. It was only with the passing of the generation that witnessed it that the floodgates of memory began to open. In the 1990s and 2000s, Oral history projects like the groundbreaking work of the 1947 Partition Archive began to record the testimonies of survivors before they were lost forever. What emerged was not a single history, but millions of micro-histories, each a universe of loss. A man remembering the smell of burning flesh from his village well. A woman who, as a child, saw her mother jump into a canal. A person who spent a lifetime wondering what happened to a friend who vanished on the other side of the border. Literature and film, from Saadat Hasan Manto's blisteringly short stories to Deepam Mehta's Phil Mirth, began to grapple with the human complexity of the trauma. This was not about assigning blame, but about acknowledging a shared, subcontinental grief that had been buried alive. Today, the Ratcliffe Line is one of the most fortified borders on Earth, a scar stitched shut with barbed wire, landmines, and the constant glare of floodlights. The villages that were once mixed are now religiously homogeneous. The shared culture of the Punjab, its poetry, its music, its jokes, was severed. A whole vocabulary of loss entered the languages: Batwara, the division; Hydrat, the exodus; Sharanarthi, refugee. The political legacy is a permanent state of tension between India and Pakistan, with 3 major wars and countless skirmishes rooted in the unresolved issues of 1947, especially Kashmir. The psychological legacy is a deep, inherited trauma, a communal suspiciousness that politicians can still easily manipulate. Why does this history of such monumental scale and sorrow remain so curiously absent from global memory? Perhaps because it complicates simple narratives of anti-colonial triumph. Perhaps because the violence was mutual, making it harder to craft a clear victim-perpetrator story. Or perhaps because the scale is simply too vast for the human mind to hold. But to ignore it is to misunderstand the modern world. The birth of India and Pakistan was the 20th century's first great episode of ethnic cleansing, a template that would sadly be repeated in Rwanda, the Balkans, and elsewhere. It demonstrated how modern bureaucracy, the census, the map, the hurried timetable, could be weaponized to unleash ancient demons. The most dangerous lines are not those drawn on battlefields, but those inscribed in law and ink. The story of partition is ultimately a warning. It is a testament to the speed with which civilized society can unravel when identity is weaponized and the state abdicates its duty to protect. It shows that freedom, when won amidst chaos and division, can carry a terrifying price. And it reminds us that history is not just about nations and treaties, but about the 15 million individual journeys of terror, loss, and reluctant survival that were the true foundation stones of the modern subcontinent. The echoes of those footsteps, of those train whistles, of that silent, waiting line on a map, still shape the world today. They whisper that borders are not just lines, but living, bleeding things. If this exploration of history's profound echoes and hidden cataclysms has held you, please support our channel's journey. Give this video a like and continue to delve deeper with us here on Winds of Thought.